Aha! An introduction to sideboards, the how and why of the other 15 cards for your Magic the Gathering constructed deck. Many Magic the Gathering players approach the sideboard as an afterthought. Their main board is often viewed as their full deck, while the sideboard's role is thought of as secondary, or even one whose purpose is ambiguous. In reality, your sideboard is no less a part of your deck than your main board. And failing to build and develop a strong sideboard means failing to build and develop a strong deck. In fact, it can be argued that your sideboard deck sees more overall play than the non-sideboard version of your deck, so failing to understand the role of the sideboard is often a critical error. This video will discuss the basic concepts of sideboarding that are often overlooked or ignored. Please note, this video is meant as an introductory lesson in sideboarding. Many of the rules and theories it will discuss have exceptions, especially in advanced situations. This video is not intended as the fully detailed end-all be-all lesson on sideboards, but is instead a guide to begin the process of understanding and building better sideboards. Let's begin. What is a sideboard? A sideboard is a collection of up to 15 cards that a player may bring to a game of Magic. After each game within a match, each player may add or remove cards from their deck for cards in their sideboard. Sideboarding does not require a one-to-one swap of cards from the main board, meaning you can add cards to your deck from your sideboard, and you are not required to remove one in return. So long as, at the start of the next game, your main deck has no fewer than 60 cards, and your sideboard no greater than 15 cards, any changes you wish to make are acceptable. Why sideboard? The goal of sideboarding is to make your deck better for games 2 and 3 by using the information of what deck your opponent is playing with, combined with the pre-game choices you made in constructing the 15 cards of your sideboard. But I'd like to offer an even simpler rule. Let's call it Rule 1 to sideboarding. The point of sideboarding is to make your deck better. A sideboard is about choice. It involves both decisions before the game in regards to what goes into your sideboard, but also, and perhaps more critically, relies on your decision-making process on the spot, in between games. A sideboard must not be random. Do not construct your sideboard in isolation, imagining random or general situations you may possibly face. No, instead, your sideboard must be constructed to the best of your ability in anticipation of the specific deck and decks you will be facing, which is why the first true step to sideboarding is... Step 1. Determine your meta. Which decks are you likely to face at the event you are playing in? Whether you are playing at Friday Night Magic or competing at a higher level, you need a plan for your matchups. Ask yourself, what decks are people currently playing? Which decks are being played the most? Which decks are possibly only being played by 1 or 2 players? Which deck is no one playing? Obviously, this involves an enormous amount of guesswork. Hopefully, if you play regularly at your local game store, you have paid attention to the decks you have come up against, and thus can make an educated guess as to what you will face during your next event. But even if you do not play regularly, or if you are playing at a new venue, there are ways you can make reasonable guesses as to what you will face. Pay attention to recent major tournaments and events, with a strong focus on both the top 8 decks from these events, as well as the overall makeup of decks in the competition. It is highly likely that your meta will reflect these winning decks to a certain degree. Step 2. Determine what your deck is weak against. So how do you determine what your deck is weak against? This is where testing comes in, and why having something like a deck library is so important. I recently recommended the website metadeck.me, and I'll restate that recommendation here. Printing out a library of decks to practice against is a great way to help determine your deck's strengths and weaknesses. And obviously, scouring the forums and subreddits for other people's reports on matchups is extremely valuable information as well. Remember that all this is a process, and an ongoing one at that. There's no easy answer, and quite frankly, if there were, the game probably wouldn't be as much fun. The first sideboarding questions you should ask are, which decks is your deck weak against and why? Do not begin building a sideboard based on which cards you might use to gain advantage over other decks. Instead, first look at it as a way to help ensure your deck does not get destroyed by other decks. Now, it is important to note that you should not sideboard in response to your opponent's deck, but rather you should sideboard in anticipation of your opponent's sideboarded deck. Your opponent will have sideboarded as well, and you must keep that in mind because that's the deck you will be facing. You will likely not be facing their original main board. So what cards are they likely to sideboard against you? You must be able to ask this question and use the likely answer to inform the choices that you make. Step 3, gaining advantage and bringing in threats. Now is when you will want to determine which cards you can include to give you an advantage over your opponent. There are 3 general types of advantages. Individual card threats are cards that you place in your sideboard to target specific cards of your opponents. These are sideboard cards that you have selected to give you a direct advantage over a specific card your opponent is playing. Some examples of this might be anything from a Skull Crack to threaten your opponent's Sphinx's Revelation, or of course cards like Pithing Needles, Slaughter Games, Surgical Extraction, to name a specific card that your opponent is playing which is a threat to you. Next are sideboard cards, which are a direct threat to your opponent's deck, or sideboard cards that hose your opponent's deck. These cards give advantage not through targeting a specific card, but through gaining advantage over the entire deck. So if your opponent has a graveyard-based strategy, sideboarding in cards that turn off graveyards would be an example of gaining advantage over the entire deck. Ghostly Prison prevents a Splinter Twin combo from working. Leyline of Punishment prevents a life gain strategy. There are many examples of this. There's one more way to get advantage through your sideboarded cards, and that's through using what's known as a transformative sideboard. Transformative sideboard cards are a kind of counterintelligence against your opponent's sideboarding. A classic example is if you run a combo deck, you might actually sideboard your combo out after game 1. Why? Because it's likely that your opponent is now sideboarding in a way to shut your combo off, or to hose it, as the kids say. So by transforming your deck's threat from combo to, say, aggro between games, your opponent has just sideboarded against a threat that no longer exists, making their deck weaker and violating the prime rule of sideboarding. You sideboard to make your deck better. 5 sideboarding tips. Do not sideboard heavily against a matchup that is already to your advantage. Some matchups will be so much in your favor that you may not need to sideboard much, if anything at all. Don't include hate cards in your sideboard just because they are in your color. Do not use the sideboard as a space for additional cards that you simply like, or feel are strong but couldn't find a place for in your main board. Test constantly. Practice, practice, practice. Test against your likely matchups and practice playing as your likely matchups against your deck so that you might better understand the advantages and the weaknesses of your opponent's deck. Finally, if you notice that a card or cards are always your first go-to to remove from your main board, then these may in fact be cards that you want to remove entirely. Paying attention to which cards you select for sideboarding out of your main deck can help you better understand what's weak in your main deck and possibly in need of replacement and improvement. I hope this video has been of some help to you, and this video was a video nomination voted on by my patrons over at Patreon. It is brought to you by their support, where even $1 a month is 1,000 times more helpful than watching a month's worth of YouTube ads. It's why this channel is still here, because of the support of viewers like you. So thank you.